I awoke with a scream, my nightshirt drenched from sweats of unquenched passion, a lingering smell of forgotten desire. As always, my mind drifted to familiar thoughts. What time is it? Relax. Calm yourself. It is not against the law to sleep. I dared to drift back asunder, to dream in a world filled with endless creations, of women far too beautiful, of birds that sang mystical symphonies, of colors that did not exist. The warmth of my bed was intoxicating, completely and utterly, for it was a terribly cold and terribly wicked winter day. I felt it in my bones as I heard the devilish whip of the wind whistling through the roof, laughing with triumph. And this is how most of my days began for as long as I can remember. I had to move before the cold imprisoned me, and my mind decayed, a rotten thing really, the optionality to roll over and die. If I told you that I had not touched, nor tasted, nor glimpsed another, I told true, as it had been well over a month since I had happened upon a fellow person. But when you live alone, without a job, and have never been one to seek meaningful friendships, you learn to speak to yourself as if you were another. Without much doubt, it could be said that I was of studious nature, a creature of habit, a peculiar being not entirely of human descent, and surely, yes, at this point you fancy me unwell. I too have heard how isolation breeds madness, how the hollow cries of solitude create contempt. But I was well equipped for the lonesome journey towards death. Trust me. I did not feel saddened. I did not feel cumbersome. There was no heartache forged within. My hatred of companionship, my loathe of simple greetings, the charmless conversations, "How are you?" But do you actually care about my well-being in the slightest polite stranger? It was all a game worthy of the label torture. Who needs any of it? Certainly not me. For I had my own shadow, and the only thing I ever needed, my closest confidante, always at arm's reach. As I stretched out my body in the utmost magnificent manner, a cacophony of sounds filled the empty room, bones cracking, teeth clacking, ankles clicking, watch ticking. The sound overcame me whilst I lay still, motionless, enveloped in its eternal rhythm. But then another, so loud, so piercing. It was the perfunctory beep signaling the dawn of a new hour. The nightstand was empty, except for a weathered and unread copy of the Holy Bible and my sleek silver watch that lay beside it. I marveled at its elegance, at its irresistible aesthetic. You may think it was only a wristwatch, and of course you would, for what more can it be? Perhaps I will find it too difficult to properly articulate its value, too taxing to describe its significance, but it was no ordinary personal attachment. It had not been a family heirloom passed on through generations, nor had I paid an extravagant amount of money for it. There was only the most delicate clasp that held it to my wrist, but where it actually attached itself was inside the dark recesses of my mind. There is where this time teller echoed its true sentiment. You see, what possessed me was the numbers. Without them, I could not live. Without them, I could not breathe. To the naked, uninformed eye, they did not reveal their tricks. But to me, from my perilous perspective, I saw the unseeable. I was well versed in their foreign language. It was wonderfully, exceptionally, positively brilliant. My own Morse code. What was it, you ask? Hear me. Listen. A watch continues to tick, nor is ever without a talk. On and on it continues, both to the ear and for the eye. My obsession, my compulsion was rooted in the seconds, the ever-changing seconds, and how they revealed to me an abundance of options. For this and for that. Go here or go there. The numbers punctured my thoughts and made my decisions from the second I arose. They told me what to wear, how to act, where to go. They even told me when to stop. It's silly, no doubt, indeed rather preposterous, yet the wonders of a found treasure overcame me. The thought of separation filled me with an anxiety that could not be replicated. You see, I had become a programmed machine and could not differentiate between myself and my programmer. Perhaps I, Victor Frankenstein, and the numbers of my monstrous salvation. I was numb from the numbers, suckling at their tit, mouth overflowing with milk, a fiend full of frenzy. Forever entangled in the slippery slope of time, I had forsaken myself with the illusion of choice. To any man unsullied by these thoughts of delusion, there must exist an example that illustrates my arithmetic. To set the scene proper, picture me in my kitchen. I know what I'm doing, but not how I'll get there. I look at the watch. The slender shape of the seconds reads 16. 1/6. Add them up, that makes 7. So into the cupboard I go, where the coffee mugs sit idly, reaching in and hooking my fingers onto the 7th cup. The 7th. And not only that, oh no, even after brewing a cup of the wicked brown sludge, I glanced again upon my watch. 21. Add them up. Yes, that's 3. So it was decided, the exact increment of sips in which I would come to ingest the beverage. Insanity, you jest? But listen. For I feared the same, my mind was melting from the presence of poison. The worry accosted me day and night, hauntingly so, until with great care I brought the dilemma upon my doctor. Whilst leaving out some of the more peculiar details of my ailment, I described it to him, and my point was well made. I've lost my mind, I'm afraid. He nodded and murmured, scribbling on his pad, would you believe that he had just the remedy to alleviate my demons? They were small pills, white pills with numbered engravings, easy to swallow with a cupful of water. In the beginning, I doubted their effectiveness, but as time wore on, I felt my disorder and its frequency to be less destructive, less consuming. And finally the day arrived where I didn't crave the ticking wisdom. I was free from my chains, no longer enslaved. A man reborn, and with such conviction. I used my favorite mug, wore my most comfortable sneakers, and as the walls of my madness collapsed, even my recollection improved. My youth flooded back to me, an abundance of warm memories and jolly songs. One that I treasured most dearly was a rhyme my mother whispered from the edge of my bed. I could remember the rhythm, but what were the words? Then suddenly, like inspiration, they struck. There was an old lady that swallowed a spider. It wiggled and jiggled and tickled inside her. How apropos! For the first time in my life, I was myself complete. Mind wiggling with wonder, belly jiggling with laughter, soul tickling with pleasure. It was the doctor again who suggested I bid good riddance to the numbers once and for all, say goodbye to my wristwatch. Abolishing the temptation, as he put it. How spectacular! How effortless he made it sound, like tossing an apple core in the trash when it is brown and wormy. Easy as it sounded, the numbers were not one to go down without a fight. For I alone knew the temptation, and how it schemed so fiercely, how it looked upon me, lurking and waiting, how clear it had been that they would never leave me unless driven by force. And so I did what the doctor said. But first I planned and I plotted. The fantasies were boundless. I pictured walloping the watch with a hammer, until yes, finally the face would become unrecognizable. I envisioned breaking it with my bare hands and tossing the shattered remains into the streets. Oh, how the neighbors would rejoice and cheer from the windows, a harmonious cry of splendor. The way in which I prepared the evening's festivities was delightfully clever. First was the matter of liquid persuasion, as every momentous occasion in Umland's life should be accompanied by the finest desires. A glass of scotch. Make it a double. Then next came the music, of which I decided to turn as loud as permitted, so loud that even a deaf man would beg for silence. The sounds of Symphony No. 5 whistled and bristled through my hollow home, whilst I lit candles. 2 here, 1 there, why not a couple everywhere? It was quite breathtaking, a mesmerizing scene of pure masterpiece. The emotion welled up within me, and I found myself swaying weightlessly, carelessly around in circles. It was rather romantic, if I'm honest. The way I held my timepiece near, the way I nuzzled it so. A last dance with the love of my life, her demise rapidly approaching. How could it be that things had gone so ill between us? For the beat of its heart was so precious, so divine. It felt almost as alive as I. Yet the beauty of love, the tragic simplicity, is that it only exists in the eye of the beholder, and therefore at any moment, a switch may be flipped, and you could decide to destroy it. Such power, such unworthiness. With the desperate need for freedom coursing through my veins, a dark rage exploded from me, and I hurled it, a fastball, straight at the wall. Again, and again. But the ticking persisted. I stomped and I stumped it, showing not a shred of mercy. Wait! Listen! Wait! Was it over? The thump-pump of my own heart drowned out the silence. But how? The vile sound remained. Over the candlelight I examined the damage. The face was smashed terribly, pieces of it hanging this way and that. Into the flame I lowered it. The sizzle, oh, so sweet. A tick, then a tock. Slowly and again. Again until nothing. Nothing left but the burnt remnants of a torturous timepiece. Fast forward through time to a place much more quiet, for the sun had long since set and darkness enveloped my home. The state of me was a wreck, for I had fallen ill after my dramatics, collapsed in my bed with not a thought in my head. The dreams I had were wicked things, tales of monsters, of screams, and of murder. I was trapped, couldn't move, overwhelmed with the sense of terror. In a web I was stuck, and along came the spider. Her 8 pure black eyes stuck right out beside her. She opened her mouth. Just one bite. Relax. It's all right. Suddenly I sat straight up in my bed, the thundering of my heart revealing its discontent. But then came a movement, chilling me to the bone. Worse than any nightmare was a nightmare come to life. A slithering shadow lurking in the dark, not but 2 feet from my bed. Who is there? Show yourself. In horror, my hand fell upon another hand, flaky, calloused, and burnt. A stranger, a murderer, a mutant. A scream, a voice, oh no, not a voice but a sound, piercing the ear. It was that of a beast in terrible agony, a shrill violin squeak hanging in the air. It stumbled upon me and into my vision, for tonight was a full moon, and the light shone through the curtains with theatrical intent. Oh my! It was wretchedly deformed and tragically burnt, contorted most wickedly. A sensation rose from my spine and traveled up, oh the feeling even now persists, sending each strand of my hair rising at once. It is such a rare occurrence, a woeful event, these instances when death appears before you. The unavoidable shadow that has been looming all along, when truly we do see just how much we hold on to. Albeit frozen in fear, I jumped from my sheets, flinging myself at the beast. Its breath was that of decay, a stench so stark that it took intense efforts not to vomit at once. Gripped in maniacal panic, I wrapped the sheet around what appeared to be its neck, and as the struggle evolved, there came a sound so familiar. A tick, then a tock. One, then the other. Another. And over again. And how could I ignore this sound? How could I not see this savage for what it was? Who am I to kill, to take a life? Not a hunter, nor a slaughterer. My murderous intentions ceased. The beastly head poked out of the dark and growled with ferociousness. This time as I looked upon it, not it but her, I saw the scarred remains of what was once a beautiful woman. Different, yes, peculiar, sure, but a living, breathing beauty right before my eyes. And such torment I had caused her. She must have known that I had surrendered the battle, as she let me lay my head upon her chest. Indeed, my suspicions were confirmed. Her heart didn't beat like mine or your own. The thumps were ticks, the pumps were tocks. A marvelous reincarnation. Her eyes met mine. A tear of sadness slid down her crusty cheek. Well, of course, after such destruction, she was in desperate need of some gentle reproach. There was only one thing to do, and it happened so fast, our bodies converging as one, until, yes, further, deeper, I wiggled, I jiggled, I tickled inside her. We gasped cries of rapture as our bodies jerked rigid, entangled in our mess of near-death experience and passionate lovemaking. For exactly 9 minutes, I know yes, because I counted along. I listened to the excellent sound of her heart beat ticking away. Then later as we stood, I had a chance to finally admire her properly. To the rest of the world she would be thought a barbarian. But to me, and to all the years that I had known her, she was perfection personified. Oh, how I cried, I wept, I fell to my knees. You are a work of art. And I, your artist. To hang her on the wall would be an injustice. To display her in a museum would be cunningly cruel. But to keep her for myself only, and my devilish pleasures, now that was just. After a few days of ravenous relations, I began to notice how she looked longingly through the windows. I knew if anyone else saw her, she'd be taken away at once. And so I cautioned her from her hopes. I explained to her the nature of hate that permeated this planet. I told tales of the nasty people outside and the twisted science experiments she would be forced into. But on and on she begged. Let her go out in the dark. Thought he. For this I couldn't argue any longer, and finally I agreed. She deserved to see the stars, feel the wind on her skin. So once the world went to sleep and the neighborhood had settled, we set out in tandem, disappearing into the night. But soon after we departed, a sobering truth smacked me right on the head, for the way she walked was disgusting, a horrifying, excruciating sight. The shadows revealed her as she truly was. Tragically, I had created a person. No, not a person, but a thing that would eternally exist in pain. It wasn't a fit of rage that befell me this time, nor another plot of careful precision, for the plan had not hatched any earlier than the execution of it. It was merely a difference in understanding, a fresh perspective. A rock had been in my hand. I cannot even remember how it got there. A rock, yes. The rock appeared over her head. Not her. It. And fell down with a terrible crack. Yes, it was my hands, for who else could it have been? The blood of the beast dripped down my arms. Down, 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 down. Further, as I continued to swing. Once, twice, 3 times, and again. Its skull split right open, the brains on display. Warm, sticky, squishy, gooey, and chewy. Yet it was not the brain that interested me. It was the heart. The heart belonged to me after all. I promise it was not stone-cold madness, but love that possessed me. Unrequited love. I pounded the chest, beat it, smashed, ripped it right open, digging deep, deep and deeper until, alas, in my hands. Right there I found it. Oh, how the feeling was ripe! I remembered the old lady who swallowed the spider, and now I knew why she had put it inside her. To leave behind a life of worry and woe. I lifted the ticking heart and admired it so. I munched and I crunched it. Every tick, every talk. The thought of it now makes me lick my lips as I talk. Perhaps I could say that the experience was frightful, but to tell you the truth, it was rather delightful. The doors slid open, and the witch entered the supermarket, a trolley rolling in front of her, as if of its own free will. Harry Blanton froze. Edlin Blackmane had been on his mind a lot this week, but not in a cutesy way. Girls were gross. Ew. No, she'd been on his mind since he'd heard the playground gossip from Webster McCarthy. Or instead, an item in her possession had been on his mind. Webster was often full of it. He once claimed he held his breath for 10 days, but stopped at the government's request. But this latest rumor had a ring of truth. What had gnawed away at Harry was what to do with this information. He needed to have a go on her broomstick. This small-town life was so dull. It wasn't even worth skipping school, because there was nothing fun to do if you did. But if he asked, magical woman or not, she'd respond like every other adult in this watching paint-dry town. Christ, kill him now. Harry pretended to inspect the sorball. Will melt your eyes and burn your tongue, and kept an eye on her. The trolley squeaked and wobbled in front of her. Despite Edlin propelling it with magic, it still had one dodgy wheel. Some things not even spells could fix. Smiling and nodding at people, her pointed hat bouncing on her head, she pulled out her shopping list. The scroll upon which she daubed her required groceries, uncoiled like a royal decree for soup and milk. It unfurled and unfurled until it all but touched the floor. Edlin was whistling "Witchy Woman" by the Eagles. Harry's jaw opened with a click. It was as if the stars had aligned only for him. A plan began to form in his prepubescent mind. Edlin was going to be shopping here for quite some time. The cogs in his brain struggled to turn. That meant her house. He dropped the sweet. There was something else that could give his life a jolt, and it wouldn't cost him a penny. Harry fled the store like someone evading a colleague with whom they didn't want it to chit-chat. He snatched his bike from the rack where he'd left it unlocked. Nobody locked things around here, and hopped on. He pumped his little legs as fast as he could. The witch's house was atop the town's highest point. A path wound up the side of the hill to where the house perched. A sheer incline plunged before the house, dropping to the town's central street. Harry arrived at Mrs. Blackmane's house in record time, panting and sweating. He dropped his bike before the black fence and then pushed inside, blinking away the spots in his vision. As he passed, the wrought iron gate squalled on its hinges, and a murder of butterflies took to the skies. A wild garden sat between the fence and the house, overflowing with life. There was dill, thyme, fennel, and sage. Garlic, foxgloves, mint, and lemon balm. Henbane, mistletoe, mandrake, poke, and nightshade. A wizened walnut tree had grown into a question mark, stooped over like an old crone. Beyond the curtain of leaves, the house stood. It was wonky like some big bully had shoved the matchstick diorama before the glue had time to set. It was a Tudor-style, half-timbered house. An exposed framework of dark oak beams formed the structure of the building. It had a thatched roof sitting on top like a farmer's straw hat. The small casement windows had diamond-patterned panes of glass set in black frames. The house had wobbly lines with no right angles in sight, as though drawn by a child or a particularly dense adult. Harry ran through the garden, smelling the spices in the air, and reached the door. The rectangular door had wide, vertical oak planks. Its wrought iron hinges and metal studs were the same shade of black. The handle was ornate, in contrast to the wood. A ring knocker, etched with flowers, sat in the middle, below a small window. Harry paused, trying to think. What if Edlin had cast protective spells? Home Alone style. He picked up a small rock from the soil and opened the door. He lobbed the stone underarm through the entryway. The rock bounced across the flagstone floor. It skipped once, twice, and thrice before rolling to a stop. It neither burst into flames nor morphed into a toad. Harry nodded, satisfied. If it was safe enough for a pebble, it was safe enough for a human child. He strode across the threshold. In the entryway, various cloaks and pointed hats hung from hooks. There was something for every season: purples, oranges, greens, yellows, blues, and blacks. Hand-sewn patterns adorned the fabric: stars, planets, plants, and flowers. Below, a selection of well-worn knee-high boots waited for their owners' feet. Ahead, the hallway carried on to the kitchen, with doors on the side. A steep, narrow staircase rose to the upper levels. Harry halted in his tracks, crackling with excitement. He felt like a heretic on the rack, pulling in several directions. Harry wanted to search everything but worked with a time limit here. He had to have his joyride, and then get out before Edlin returned. Where would it be? In non-magical homes, people seldom kept vehicles upstairs. He had to assume this was the case for witches' homes, too. A cozy parlor was off to one side, with a sagging sofa, threadbare armchairs, and an empty fireplace. A patchwork rug covered the wooden floor. Harry pushed on and headed for the kitchen. The smell of warm, hunger-baiting baking filled the air, doughy and delicious. A crooked black stovetop leaned on uneven legs. A large cauldron was soaking in the sink, with soapy bubbles dribbling over the rim. And there, off to the side, next to a dustpan and brush, was the witch's broomstick. Harry's heart leapt into his throat, ribbiting like a frog behind his windpipe. There it was within reach. Success. Part of him had thought he wouldn't find it. Part of him thought Webster had lied when he said Edlin flew everywhere on her broomstick. And yet, here it was, leaning to the side as though it were a common cleaning item. Harry snatched the broomstick up. It was heavy. He frowned a little. He'd expected it to be light as a feather, floating in his grip like a helium balloon. Well, duh. Sometimes he astounded even himself with his stupidity. He couldn't expect the magic to work when holding it like this. You had to be riding it. Speaking of, where should he test it? Harry looked out the kitchen windows. His vacant, zombie-like expression bloomed into a grin. He sprinted down the hallway, skidding on the stone and almost crashing into the front door. He took the stairs 2 at a time, then paused on the wooden landing, gasping. A ladder led up to the loft. In for a magical penny, in for a mystical pound. Clutching the broomstick in one hand, Harry scrambled up the ladder, which was no mean feat. But he managed it without falling and breaking his ankles. In the attic, old wooden chests and cloth-covered pieces of furniture collected dust. Stacks and stacks of leather-bound books towered in miniature mazes. Cardboard boxes overflowed with forgotten tomes of lore. Motes drifted through the sunbeams coming through the highest window in the house. He wrinkled his nose. Books were for nerds. Harry released the latch and pushed open the window, peering down the steep incline to the town below. From up here, he could see the whole world. His house, Webster's house, the school, the church, the supermarket. He climbed up onto the ledge and tucked the broomstick between his legs. The wind rippled his clothes. Harry fought the dizzying vertigo. You didn't need to be afraid of heights if you could fly. He leapt from the window, hooting. Is it a bird? Is it a plane? No, it's... Someone else was flying on a broomstick, coming in the opposite direction. Harry locked eyes with the witch. A look of pure and utter bafflement crossed Edlin's features. It had never occurred to him that she might have two brooms, a magical flying one and a second for regular cleaning. But he did indeed fly. 5 meters. And then gravity pulled him down, and he crashed into the road below. Harry Blanton exploded like a water balloon filled with ketchup. So I told my doctor I broke my arm in 2 places, he said. Well, don't go back to those places. The break room burst into hysterics, Bob delivering yet another side-splitting punchline. People leaned on chairs and doubled over, wiping tears. The joy in the room was palpable, like it had a life of its own. Except for Tom Greaves. He stood by the water cooler, staring expressionless into his mug of black coffee. Loud and overwhelming laughter swirled around him, but he was untouched by it. His mouth remained a thin, tight line, his face as blank as a sheet of paper. Bob noticed and grinned. Tom, man, you gotta give me something here. I just killed it. Even you must admit that was funny. Tom glanced up, offering a forced, hollow smile. Not really my kind of thing. The room fell awkwardly silent for a second before Bob's booming laugh filled the space, leading the others to follow. They knew Tom wasn't like them. It wasn't that he didn't try. He just didn't understand jokes, and he never had. Humor for him was as distant as the stars. Since he was a child, jokes seemed like puzzles with missing pieces. When other kids cracked up at cartoons or wordplay, he sat there, confused. His father never laughed either, constantly telling him, "Laughter is a waste of time, Tom. You should be serious. Life's too short for jokes." And so Tom buried himself in work. He could understand numbers, tasks, and goals. But the gnawing question always lingered. Why don't I feel what they feel? Why can't I laugh like they do? Well, after another joyless day at work, Tom trudged home in the rain. A flickering neon sign caught his attention as he passed a small alley, Fenton's Rare Books. The door was ajar, the dim light inside casting strange shadows across the cobblestone path. Tom normally wasn't one to stop for something so obscure, but something pulled at him that night. He stepped inside. The shop smelled of old paper, dust, and something sweet, almost like sugar cookies. Shelves stretched high, packed with ancient tomes and odd trinkets. Tom wandered the aisles aimlessly when a small, thin book caught his eye. It was tucked into the corner of a dusty shelf, half hidden behind a stack of faded newspapers. He reached for it, his hand shaking slightly as his fingers touched the worn leather cover. The title was embossed in gold, "Killer Jokes." Something about the book called to him made his pulse quicken. He opened it to the first page and read aloud, almost without thinking. Why did the chicken join a band? Because it had the drumsticks. And then something incredible happened. Tom laughed. Not a smirk or a forced chuckle, but a deep, belly-shaking laugh. His body trembled with it. He hadn't felt anything like this before. It startled him. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with graying hair and a crooked smile, appeared behind the counter. "Ah, I see you found my little treasure," he said. "That book has power." "Power?" Tom asked, wiping tears from his eyes. The man nodded slowly. Everyone has a sense of humor buried deep down. That book helps bring it out. Tom paid for it, excitement buzzing in his chest. At home, Tom sat at his kitchen table, the book in front of him like a prize. The room was still, save for the occasional rainwater drip from his coat, now hanging over a chair. He picked up the book and began reading again. Why don't some couples go to the gym? Because some relationships don't work out. He laughed again, harder this time. The sound filled the small apartment, bouncing off the walls. He couldn't stop. Every joke hit perfectly. And with each turn of the page, his laughter grew louder, more uncontrollable. It was like a dam had broken inside him, flooding his body with years of suppressed joy. He didn't sleep that night. He read the entire book cover to cover, laughing until his sides hurt and his throat was raw. It was magical. He finally got it. He could finally laugh. But as the hours passed and the dawn light seeped through his windows, Tom began feeling strange unease. Were the jokes so funny, or was it something else? Tom wasn't sure if he was laughing because he wanted to, or couldn't stop. By morning, his obsession had taken root, digging into his thoughts like a vine that wrapped itself tighter with every passing hour. The world outside faded compared to the thrill that coursed through him, the thrill of finally understanding and belonging. At work, Tom could hardly contain his excitement. He had felt like an outsider for so long, and now he had a secret weapon that made people laugh and made him feel alive. The jokes in the book weren't just funny, they were powerful. He burst into the break room, restless energy propelling him forward. Bob told one of his usual jokes that once left Tom isolated and lost. But not today. Today Tom was eager, no, desperate, to share his newfound humor. Without hesitation, he interrupted Bob mid-punchline, cutting through the room like an electric charge. "Why did the tomato turn red?" Tom asked, his voice brimming with confidence. "Because it saw the salad dressing." The room erupted, just as he had hoped. Raw and spontaneous laughter exploded from his colleagues, catching everyone off guard. Faces flushed with mirth, bodies doubled over as they gasped for breath between fits of uncontrollable giggles. Tom's grin widened, his heart racing with exhilaration. This was what he had missed for so long. This was the joy he had watched from the outside, the joy he had longed to feel. However, he could not stop because he was already reciting jokes from memory to keep the laughter going. His hands trembled with excitement as he thought of the next joke, his voice louder, more urgent. "I tried to catch fog yesterday," he said, barely pausing for breath. "I missed." The infectious sounds of joy spilling into the hallway increased the noise, and more people wandered into the break room. It was a symphony of laughter, now swelling to a cacophony that filled every corner of the room. Tom could feel the energy around him, how people clung to every word he said, and how their eyes sparkled with anticipation for the next punchline. It was like riding a wave, and Tom was at the crest, soaring higher than he ever thought possible. "I'm reading a book about anti-gravity," he shouted over the din, his eyes gleaming. "It's impossible to put down." But something was changing. The once joyful atmosphere began to take on a strange edge. It deepened, growing harsher and more guttural. People weren't just laughing anymore. They were gasping and choking on it. Bob's face turned an alarming shade of red, veins bulging at his temples as his eyes began to water uncontrollably. His voice, once carefree, became strained and frantic. His chest heaved in the effort to draw breath between the relentless spasms of laughter that racked his body. Tom faltered, a flicker of doubt creeping into his mind. "Guys, are you okay?" he asked, wavering as he stepped back, watching the scene unfold. But there was yet to be a response. Bob's body shook as though possessed. His mouth twisted into a grin too wide, too unnatural. Brown eyes bulged, bloodshot, as his body contorted, fighting against the urge that consumed him. Tom's heart raced. Panic clawed at his throat as he scanned the room. It wasn't just Bob. One by one, his coworkers were collapsing, their bodies shaking with uncontrollable mirth. Their faces, once filled with joy, now contorted into masks of horror as they gasped for air, their laughter turning to gurgles. Some clutched at their chests. Others fell to the floor, convulsing as their bodies buckled under the strain. Then, it happened. Bob collapsed in a sickening, sudden silence. The room seemed to freeze at that moment. His body hit the ground with a dull thud, his face still twisted in that horrifying grin, wide-eyed and lifeless. His mouth twitched once, twice, and then it was still. Tom's breath hitched in his throat as the horror of the situation crashed over him. Bob was dead. He had killed him with a joke. And it wasn't just Bob. One by one, the others followed, their bodies dropping to the floor, their faces frozen in the same grotesque, posthumous smiles. The room that had been filled with life only moments ago was now filled with bodies, the air heavy with the scent of death. A cold, creeping dread settled in Tom's chest as he reached for the book in his pocket. The room was eerily quiet now, the only sound being the distant hum of the air conditioning, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded moments before. He looked around, his heart pounding in his ears. They were all dead. He had killed them. Tom stood alone in silence, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. The jokes had worked. Oh, they had worked too well. The laughter he once longed for had turned into something monstrous and deadly. "You ever hear the one about the guy who couldn't stop laughing?" Tom said softly, his voice shaking as the reality of everything sank in. Turns out, neither could his friends. But there was no one left to hear him. No one left to laugh at the punchline. Only the silence and the book still pulsed with an eerie, sinister energy in his hands. His mind reeled. How had it come to this? Panicking, Tom bolted to the bathroom. He had to get rid of the book. In the restroom, he threw the book into the garbage bin and stared at it, his heart racing. Was it over? Could he be free of it? But something dark and irrational gnawed at him. As he stepped out of the bathroom, 2 police officers were already at the scene. They approached him calmly. "Mr. Greaves, we need to ask you some questions," one of them said. Tom's throat tightened. Could he speak without killing them? He opened his mouth cautiously, terrified of what might happen. It was horrible," Tom stammered. "They just started laughing. I didn't know what was happening." To his relief, the officers took notes. No one laughed. After answering their questions, Tom left the building, but the gnawing feeling persisted. The book was still there, wasn't it? But it wasn't gone. The compulsion tugged at him, darker and stronger now. Before he knew it, he found himself back in the restroom. With trembling hands, he retrieved the book from the garbage bin and clutched it against his chest. As he left the building, the security guard asked, "Is everything all right, Mr. Greaves?" Tom tried not to answer, but the words slipped out before he could stop them. Why did the golfer bring extra pants? In case he got a hole in one. The guard starts laughing, but it quickly turns to gasps. His body shook violently, his voice deepening into a desperate, choking noise until, with one last breath, he collapsed, dead. Tom backed away in horror. It was the book. It had to be. The jokes were only deadly when he carried the book. but he couldn't let it go. Still shocked and realizing this, Tom started walking down the street when a woman crossed his path, smiling. "Good morning." Tom clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to speak, but the words forced their way out. Why did the bicycle fall over? It was too tired. She doubled over instantly, clutching her stomach. Her laughter turned into choking sobs as her body convulsed, and she fell to the ground, dead. Tom didn't even look back. His steps quickened, his head down, eyes fixed on the slick pavement. But the sound of screeching tires made him flinch. A taxi screeched to a stop beside him, the driver yelling, "Watch where you're going." Again, Tom tried to keep silent, but the joke spilled out. "I used to play piano by ear, but now I use my hands." The driver howled, clutching his steering wheel until his body shook uncontrollably. Then there was silence. Tom ran down the street. He couldn't escape it. A joke slipped from his lips whenever someone crossed his path or spoke to him, killing them. Tom reached his apartment, his heart pounding like a drum. His footsteps felt heavy. The weight of what had just happened was pulling him down, threatening to bury him. His thoughts raced, but he couldn't focus on anything. All he knew was that he had to get inside, away from everyone in the world that his jokes were tearing apart. As he approached the door to his building, his neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, stood outside in the small yard, watering her plants. She was always cheerful, always ready with a kind word or a smile. Today was no different. She looked up from her flowers, the hose still spraying water over the petunias, and said, "Hey, Tom. Rough day at work?" Tom stopped dead in his tracks. His throat tightened, panic flaring inside him. He knew what would happen if he answered. But the words, he couldn't stop them. They surged up like a wave, unstoppable, crashing through the barriers of his will. "Knock, knock," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, trembling. Mrs. Alvarez smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "Oh, Tom, you and your jokes. Okay, I will buy it. Who's there?" Tom's heart raced, his body shaking as he tried to hold it back, but the punchline slipped through his lips before he could stop it. "Orange." Mrs. Alvarez chuckled, playing along, unaware of the danger. "Orange? Who?" Tom's voice was barely his own as he whispered, "Orange. You glad I didn't say banana?" The transformation was immediate. Mrs. Alvarez burst into laughter, the sound joyful at first, light and airy, just like the countless times Tom had heard her laugh. But then it deepened, growing louder, sharper, and more desperate. Her body began to tremble, her knees buckling under its force. Her hand dropped the hose, water spraying wildly across the grass. Tom watched, helpless, as Mrs. Alvarez crumpled to the ground, clutching her stomach, tears streaming down her face. Her voice echoed in the small yard, a sound that grew more horrific with every passing second. Her face contorted, her body convulsing in violent spasms as she gasped for air between the uncontrollable fits of mirth. Then, just like the others, she stopped, and there was a sickening silence. Mrs. Alvarez lay still, her body twisted unnaturally in the grass. Her eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the sky. Her mouth was frozen in a grotesque smile. Tom staggered backward, bile rising in his throat as the horror of what he had done consumed him. All he could do was turn and run, slamming his apartment door behind him, the sound echoing in the empty hallway like a gunshot. Inside, the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. He locked the door, twisting the deadbolt with trembling hands as though it could keep the madness at bay. But deep down, he knew it was no use. Look at him, now. He was no longer in control. Tom stumbled to the window, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He yanked the curtains shut, blocking out the world outside, as if that simple act could protect the people beyond the glass from the curse he carried. His mind raced, replaying the events of the day. The laughter, the death. Over and over, he saw their faces, frozen in that same horrible grin, their eyes wide with terror, their bodies lifeless. And it was his fault. All of it. His hands shook as he stared at the book, its pages now glowing faintly in the darkness, as though it pulsed with some malevolent life of its own. The jokes had come so easily at first, innocent and harmless. But now, every word slipped from his mouth was a weapon, a punchline that could kill. He couldn't even speak without fearing the consequences. No matter how hard he tried, every word twisted into a joke. And every joke was deadly. Tom buried his face in his hands, tears spilling down his cheeks. As he sat there, his body trembling with fear and regret, the final joke lingered on his lips, waiting. It hung in the air like a dark cloud, a punchline that hadn't yet been told, but was ready to escape at any moment. He could feel and taste it, and the urge to speak it grew stronger with each passing second. But this time, there would be no audience, no laughter, no one left to hear the joke. Just him. The rain had stopped, and the streetlight's dim glow illuminated the deserted streets. Tom peered through the curtains, his heart pounding. There was nothing but a blank wall where Fenton's rare books had been. The shop was gone. Tom's breath hitched in his throat. Had he imagined it? His hands clenched the book tighter. The room was so still, yet in the silence, Tom could swear he heard a low, sinister chuckle, faint and distant like it was carried on the wind. Tom backed away from the window, his heart racing. The thought echoed inside his mind, growing louder with every passing second. The book was still in his hands. It was real. It was the first real job Caroline had since the move. She had gotten a few odd jobs from the local temples to make sure some high society types didn't undeadify themselves. The clients and motivations for her services varied, wildly. Some were loved ones of the deceased, asking that she made sure their final rest wouldn't be disturbed. Others were rivals of the recently departed that did not want a vengeful specter exacting its rightful revenge. Either way, they wouldn't be returning. Caroline made sure of that. The routine was the same. Pay the toll for passage on to the next life, activation of the will and closure of all contracts under their names. That was easy. The living always were. The difficulty was dealing with the dead. They never wanted to go. Then you had to do some errand for them. Usually making Caroline look like a loony and constantly interacting with spirits gave her a headache. With this particular job, she could feel a migraine coming on. The house lay forgotten in a long-abandoned town, its shattered windows clouded by the night's frost. A sign clung to a rusted chain beside Caroline's head as she approached the door. It had been completely covered by moss and ivy. It was also dead like every inch of flora in town. Caroline cautiously began to examine the sign. "Welcome to all," she calmly read as she scratched away at the decaying moss. At her touch, the chain, sign, and a layer of ivy came free from the wall. To her surprise, the newly freed sign simply disintegrated when it hit the ground. A cloud of what she hoped was just dust enveloped her. Caroline sputtered and coughed as she removed a vial of holy water. She removed the stopper and doused herself in the holy liquid. The dust dissipated, and the ivy near his feet slithered away. "I hope the witch knows what she is doing," she mumbled to herself as she put the vial back into her travel robes. Then Caroline took one deep breath and knocked on the rotted door. Immediately, a young boy opened the door with a smile. "Mom, you're bah!" The little boy faltered as disappointment killed the enthusiastic greeting. "I am afraid I'm not your mother, but she asked me to visit," Caroline stated cheerfully. The boy's expression soured. "I also bring a letter and a gift from her," Caroline continued, ignoring the light tension forming in her head. She reached into one of his travel pouches beneath her robes and brought out a red envelope addressed to Hiram, my little knight, along with a small package bound in red ribbons, then handed them to. The boy's face beamed with childish joy. "Is your father home?" Caroline asked, trying to sound innocent. The boy's face returned once again to an expression Caroline thought could only be conjured by sucking a lemon. "I will get him," the boy begrudgingly replied as he stormed off in search of his father. When Hiram returned, he was now wearing the contents of the gift, a little knight's helmet. Caroline's heart froze in her chest. "Pape said he will be up in a second. He also said I am to keep an eye on you," the boy said in his best menacing tone. "I would never try anything with a noble knight standing guard," Caroline stated, regaining her composure. "Good," Hiram stated proudly as he stood at attention. When Hiram's father arrived, Caroline's heart shattered. What was left of the man shambled up to the door, missing sinew and tissue, replaced by dead vine and decaying moss. The ivy, strings, and the corpse, their puppet. The rotting, shambling mound looked at the boy. Caroline noted the tension in her head was now like a vice. Hiram looked like he was listening to some unheard voice. He reached out and grabbed the remnants of his father's hand. "What if she tries to hurt you? I can help," the boy pleaded. The boy's face hardened in response to some unheard reprimand. Hiram stomped off back down the hallway. The corpse turned to face Caroline. "Begone, ferryman, you have no business here," a legion of voices commanded. The pain was now drilling into Caroline's head, throbbing harder and harder with every word. "My rot runs too deep and is too old for you to fight. This land is dead. This land is mine," the voices gloated. Cold sweat trickled down Caroline's back. "You are right, of course. I'm just here to make sure the agreement has been upheld, per the mother's wishes," she replied, grinding the words out through the pain. The corpse smiled. "Ah, yes, the witch. She is dead then. Please come in and see how I have upheld the bargain. I insist," the voices said hypnotically. Caroline's vision began to dull, as did the pain. "I haven't hurt the boy. As you have seen, he is safe, unless you decide to break the agreement," the voices stated, convinced they had upheld the lie. Driven by an unseen force, Caroline's hands shot up and grabbed what was left of the shambling mound's neck. "May you never find peace," a female voice thundered from Caroline's body. Her head felt like it was being torn apart. "The boy's soul is forfeit then, ferryman," the voices retorted. "Your illusion is gone, you shriveled weed. Give me my son." The witch's specter wailed as it leapt to the shambling corpse from Caroline's body. Immediately she could think clearly again. The rage and pain of Hiram's mother, now gone from her. The corpse began to shake as spectral forms fought for control. Caroline ran past the otherworldly struggle and into the house. The dead roots everywhere made running treacherous, but she had to finish her task while the creature was distracted. Caroline followed the vines and roots to where they were thickest, to the basement. It was dark, but for a pulsating purple glow. Caroline stalked toward the light's source, a beating heart pierced by a blade and enshrined in a mess of thick necrotic roots and vines. The blade pulsated, pouring energy into the heart, which in turn pumped life into the rest of the shambling mound with rhythmic, sickening wet throbs. "I have never had a ferryman before." "Yes, you will be a good host," a discordant voice called. Caroline could no longer look at anything but the blade. She could no longer think of anything but the blade. She barely even realized she'd begun walking towards the blade. Caroline summed up all her will and closed her eyes as she began to chant. In her mind's eye she saw herself and the heart in darkness. As she continued to chant, the heart's pumping slowed rapidly. She smiled in relief, knowing she had disrupted the flow of necromantic energies from the blade, without which the heart quickly withered and died. Time finally collected the debt it was owed. The blade also began to grow dim. Without the monster's support, the blade could no longer control the will of all the souls it had shackled. An image of a devilish smile flashed in Caroline's mind. It was quickly replaced by a brilliant light. The souls had been freed. They wanted vengeance, and they would have it. Caroline opened her eyes to see the blade begin to glow again, differently now, as the specters of the dead flew into it. The cursed blade glowed brighter and brighter, until it turned molten, setting fire to the roots and vines. The flames spread quickly along the dead, dry flora, turning the basement into a firestorm. Caroline took this as her cue to leave. Running back up and out the front door, she did her best to ignore the two still forms laying in the hallway. With the house collapsing as the fire climbed higher, she moved a safe distance away to watch as the flames burned away the horror it had sheltered. She saw the specters dancing within the inferno, the flames following their movements to ensure every last shred of filth was purged. Caroline just watched, enraptured, until her attention was caught by a familiar voice calling to her. "Ferryman, we need a ride to the other place." "Ah, please." Hiram's ghost asked nervously, before looking back at his parents. They nodded approval. "They said to give you this as well," Hiram stated as he pointed to a singed small pouch on the ground. Caroline smiled. "This is more than enough. Thank you, Hiram," she stated as she retrieved the payment. "Before I begin, do you wish to pass any messages on to the living?" Caroline shouted to her spectral audience. The only reply was the distant sounds of fire and flame. As they continued to spread, she began to chant. "I, Caroline, release you from this mortal coil and ferry the dead on to the next life. The toll has been paid for these souls. They pass on with my blessing and protection." "Hiram!" With his name called, the boy faded away. Caroline then proceeded to instinctively call out names, and with each name called, a specter disappeared. It took her almost an hour to finish the ritual, but when she opened her eyes again, the ghosts were gone, and the town would soon follow. The fire was consuming everything. She stood in the only unburned stretch of land as far as she could see. Exhausted, Caroline simply sat down and watched the town burn. Lila Kane shivered under the thin blankets of her bed, deliberately twirling the smooth key between her fingers. Another disagreement between her downstairs neighbors drowned out the sound of her radio. Her obsession with finding whatever her key unlocked kept her in a trance, blissfully ignoring her miserable conditions. This key, her key, consumed her thoughts. Years spent attempting to unlock the origins of her mystical companion are all that kept her sane in her dreary existence. Lila consumed every shred of information relevant to it: TV documentaries, interviews with experts, books, magazine articles. She learned until there was no learning left to learn. Today she would begin the final leg of her quest. Today she would head to the pyramids of Peru. Lila sipped the last delicate drops of her sweet tea and hurriedly packed her small backpack. Lila saved every spare dollar for 3 years in anticipation of this moment. She stepped into the airport lobby and rang up one ticket to Peru. "Please see attendant." Her excitement dampened as she slogged to the attendant. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Your passport is expired." No, look. I have 4 months left on it. She held up her passport, pointing at the expiration date. The attendant gave her the deadpan look of someone who desperately needed a new job. And you could re-enter America clear until the day it expires. Peru won't let you enter without 6 months left on your passport. With a one-way ticket, they may deny you entry regardless. Angry tears stung her eyes and blurred his vision. Every step back to her disheveled apartment felt heavier than the last. Her frustration boiled inside of her. Think, think, think. She squeezed the key tight, imprinting its shape on her palm. She breathed deeply, attempting to calm her thoughts. Her gaze swept over pictures displayed on her drab walls. Happy memories of her childhood stared back at her. She jolted upright. The cruise. Holy crap! I can cruise out of America without a passport. She gently placed the key in its leather pouch and placed it beside her bed. She jumped into the air, landed in her chair and began typing, "Cruises to Peru. Buy unsold last-minute cabins half off. This is too good to be true." 5 days later, she stepped into the stateroom that would be her home until the ocean carried her to Peru. The travel time was less than ideal, but the accommodation was better than any she'd had in years. She watched soft red sunsets, slept in as she pleased, and ate chef-prepared meals every day. One morning she awoke to the stateroom shaking violently. Loud crashes and the screams of frightened children echoed through the hallway. Lila attempted to stand, but sudden lurching sent her crashing down into her nightstand. Shards of glass pierced her skin as she maneuvered herself onto her hands and knees. Warm blood poured from the gash on her forehead into the corner of her mouth. The metallic taste made her gag, and she spat forcefully, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. Bleeding and motion sick, she continued crawling toward the window. Enormous waves surged in the ocean and crashed against the ship. Lightning cracked and illuminated the horizon for an instant before the thunder roared. Waves of pain pounded in her head with each thunderous boom. Each time the brightness of lightning bolts filled the room, her eyes desperately scanned the floor. She reached up and searched for her leather pouch. Her heart sank. Everything that had once sat upon her nightstand now lay scattered across the floor. Her fingers searched frantically in the dark. The boat lurched violently, first left, then straight down. A familiar knot tied her stomach. Last night's dinner spewed from her mouth. The acid burned her throat and nose. Ignoring post-vomit trembling, she wiped her chin and continued feeling for the key. Her fingers slipped through the war, slippery mess, and over broken glass. She reached blindly under the bed. Lila inched forward, and a stabbing pain tore into her knee. Her key! She wiped the filth from her hand with her shirt. She rolled onto her back, clutching the key in her hands. Relief steadied her body as the only object she truly loved was back in her possession. The storm calmed down, and the crew began putting everything back in order. Tension that thickened the air began to dissipate. Lila picked glass splinters from her hands and showered the vomit from her body. The captain came on the loudspeaker. "Due to severe storm damage to the port, we regret to inform you all excursions to Peru are canceled. We truly apologize for any inconvenience. Full refunds will be issued to those who booked an excursion." Lila felt her heart quicken. No. This can't be right. Years planning, researching, living in a shithole to save money, expired passport, last-minute trip to Peru on a fucking boat. After all that, we aren't going to stop at the one place I needed to go. Another obstacle, another setback, another failure. The key began to feel like a burden. Rage burned in her. Her passion for this quest consumed her mind. Obsession with finding what item the key unlocked had become the most important aspect of her life. And now that she was so close, the opportunity was slipping through her fingers like sand. She grabbed the key and clenched her fist. No, I am not losing this. I am too close. She entered the ship's store and scanned the shelves. Perfect. Down yo. Carolina Reaper. Chips, D. She tore open the bag and immediately the smell made her eyes water. She shoved a handful into her mouth and forced herself to chew. Her eyes teared up. She gagged and recoiled. Seat began forming on her forehead. Oh God, these are hot. What makes them hotter? Water. Water makes capsaicin worse. She grabbed a big bottle of water and gulped mouthfuls of the cool liquid down between bites. The heat intensified. Her clothing became wet with perspiration, and her hair stuck to her face. The spice ignited a fiery, searing pain in her stomach. She reached into her backpack and pulled out her 2-pack of EpiPens. She uncapped the first one and jabbed it into her thigh. She winced for a second before the torment of the capsaicin pulled her mind away from the needle. Halfway done. Don't chicken out. She forced herself to down the remaining chips. They burned like fire from her tongue to her stomach. She gulped water, stoking the flame. She poured the remaining water down the back of her shirt. She uncapped the remaining EpiPen and drove it into her thigh with a swift, forceful jab. Lila stumbled onto the pool deck, forcing in short, ragged breaths and clutching her chest. Her weakening legs buckled and she tripped over chairs, causing a scene. Other pool-goers stared aghast. Lifeguards rushed to her side. "Help me," she whispered. "Medical emergency! Get the stretcher." Lifeguards shoved spectators out of the way and rushed her to the infirmary. The small medical facility was already a chaotic mess and overcapacity due to injuries from the morning storm. Gall. Her chest tightened and her pulse shot over 200 as the adrenaline did its job. Distracted doctors loomed over her while overworked nurses administered drugs and drew blood. "Call for a helicopter," the doctor shouted. "She is having a myocardial infarction. We can't treat this here." He turned to Lila. "It's okay. You're going to be fine. We are arranging for you to get to a proper hospital where they can take better care of you, okay? You're going to be fine." The whir of helicopter blades terrified her. The wind and whirring of the blades, coupled with straps tying her down, created a feeling of helplessness, which resulted in her pulse climbing higher. "Clot buster," the medic explained in heavily accented English. He put the bitter pill in her mouth and tipped a cup of water to her lips to help her to swallow. The searing pain of the Carolina Reaper was renewed with a tiny sip of water, and her breathing became ragged again. Soon after admission to the hospital, her sweating and shortness of breath normalized. Not long after that, her pulse returned to normal. The fire in her stomach and raw burning in her mouth lingered as a reminder of the price she paid to get this far. The doctors were smart enough to realize she had not had a heart attack, and she was smart enough to leave out the part about the EpiPens. The doctor spoke in English. "You did not have a heart attack." He looked at her with narrow eyes. "There are cases of people dying due to severe reactions to foods. Why on earth did you keep eating? You could have died." The doctor shook his head and headed to his next patient. She looked at her hospital gown and her soaked clothing. "As soon as I disappear, they will come looking for me. They know I have no legal right to stay in this country." She dug through the hospital bag and pulled out her pants, leather pouch still tucked securely in her pocket. "Got it." As the janitor passed by, she asked where the lost and found was. She ran her fingers through her hair, grabbed her backpack and bag of clothing, and walked briskly to the lost and found. She carefully selected a new wardrobe, a pair of jeans, a plain shirt, and a baseball cap. She even found a pair of sunglasses. Perfect. She tossed her old clothes into the linen bin and slipped out the door. She found herself in a large city with an obvious tourist population. Yes. English language signs touted day trips to nearby ruins on most street corners. She paused in front of one particularly interesting sign: Pyramids. The ride to the pyramid was rough. The open-air van ran over uneven roads, bouncing tourists up out of their seats. She silently corrected the tour guide's historical inaccuracies as she clutched her leather pouch and planned her next moves. Every bump in the ride brought her closer to her goal. The ancient structure that stood before her was magnificent. This was not the pyramid she sought, though. That pyramid was an hour away on foot. She broke away from the group and began her trek. The jungle air was thick and hot. The humidity slowed her body. She felt heavy and deprived of oxygen as she trudged forward. She grabbed the key. "Almost there, little one. Almost there," she whispered, as if comforting a tired child nearing the end of a long journey. She swore she could feel it stir in her hand, a faint swirling pulse radiating gently through her fingers, urging her on. She dismissed the feeling as excitement. The imposing shadow of the pyramid loomed over her. This is it. Exhilaration surged through her and heightened her senses. She trembled with excitement and ran her fingers over the pyramid's stone wall. Whatever answers she needed, whatever secret this key kept locked away, the answer lay in the giant structure before her. Eerie shadows filled the areas around her as nightfall crept in. Her excitement kept tiredness at bay. She bloodied her fingers, moving mounds of dirt and stone. The key urged her on. She dropped and dug deeper, ignoring the sharp stones that dug into her knees. She broke through. The inside of the pyramid looked unnatural, as if the structure had swallowed itself. She trekked down the hall, dimly lit by her cell phone, until the key commanded her to stop. A small stone box sat perched on an elevated section of ground. It was covered in moss, and several insects crawled across it. She knew immediately that this is what her key unlocked. A supernatural push to open the box forced its way into her mind. Her obsession burned in her now with new fervor. She clawed at the box, ripping dirt and moss off the weathered stone and slapping away insects. Her heart pounded in her ears. The stone gleamed with an unnatural sheen. The box appeared ancient and menacing, as if watching her. Trembling, her fingers dug the key out of its pouch. Its gentle encouragement transformed into fierce, demanding urgency that pulled her into a hypnotic state. She put the key into the lock and turned. She felt a pop and heard a click. The air grew cold like ice. The key felt cold and lifeless in her hand. It slipped through her fingers and clanged on the floor. The chorus of chirping insects transformed to high-pitched, chaotic shrieking and mingled with the frantic screams of jungle monkeys. Their futile cries warned of the evil about to be unleashed. She snapped out of her trance. The object of her fixation, years of searching, was finally about to pay off. A slight movement of the lid gave better illumination to the grooves of its edge. The ancient hieroglyphics formed fragmented words. Her lips mouthed the words of a long-forgotten language. It took a moment for her to translate the words. Prison, demon, souls, dread washed over her, suffocating her. The lid flew open. A black, swirling apparition screamed and dissipated into the air. Her blood ran cold as the shadow tore through the air. Demonic wailing filled the pyramid and echoed into the forest. It dissipated out of sight, but something terrible lingered. An unseen force twisted and ripped at reality until it began to break apart. Oh, God, what have I done?